They say every family hides secrets, but some secrets are too monstrous to be buried, too horrific to be forgiven. In the small farming town of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, a story has lingered for nearly 2 centuries, one that locals still whisper about when the wind rattles windows at night. It is the story of the Callahan family and the attic where 39 children were said to be kept in cages. The Callahan estate was built in 1847, standing tall on a hill that overlooked the farmland below. To most, it looked like a symbol of wealth and respectability. Wide porches, tall white columns, and acres of land stretching into the distance. But the house had a presence about it. Its shutters seemed too narrow, its windows too watchful. People described it as a house that breathed. The family themselves appeared ordinary at first. John Callahan, the father, was a respected businessman dealing in grain and tobacco. His wife Eliza was polite, though strangely cold, as if she lived in her own world. They had one daughter, Catherine, who was rarely seen outside the property. Some said Catherine was ill. Others whispered she was simply not allowed to leave. But there was something strange about the Callahan household. Servants who worked there often left without explanation. A few, when questioned later, refused to speak of what they had seen. Others, when pressed, would only mutter the same word: attic. At night, neighbors claimed to hear sounds drifting from the mansion. At first, they thought it was the cries of animals, cats perhaps, or dogs locked away. But the longer they listened, the more certain they became that it wasn't animals at all. It was children. High-pitched cries, muffled sobs, and sometimes the unmistakable sound of hands beating against wooden walls. Yet no one dared confront the Callahans directly. They were powerful, respected, and wealthy, and in a time when reputation mattered more than truth, silence was easier than suspicion. But everything changed in the winter of 1853. A servant girl named Mary Donnelly ran from the Callahan home in the dead of night. Her clothes were torn, her skin scratched, her face pale with terror. She burst into the nearest farmhouse and begged them not to send her back. Through tears, she told them what she had seen: cages, wooden cages, built into the attic of the Callahan mansion, and inside them, dozens of children. She swore they were real. She swore she had seen their faces, pale and thin, their hands reaching through the bars. She claimed some of them didn't speak anymore. Some didn't move at all. At first, the townsfolk dismissed her words as hysteria, but Mary's trembling fear was hard to ignore, and she was not the only one. Another servant, weeks later, told a similar story. He described the same attic, the same cages, the same children. He claimed the Callahans lured orphans, runaways, and sometimes even children from poor families into their home, offering work, food, or shelter. Once inside, they were never seen again. The accusation spread quickly, but still, no one dared to challenge the Callahans openly. The family's wealth and influence kept them untouchable, and yet the whispers grew. Parents began to keep their children closer. Doors were locked earlier. Strangers were watched with suspicion. And every night, when the wind carried sound from the hilltop mansion, the townsfolk swore they could hear the cries of the missing. The Callahans denied everything. To visitors, their home was spotless, their hospitality warm. But the attic door remained locked, and no servant was ever allowed to linger upstairs. It became a rule of survival in Harrodsburg: do not look too closely at the Callahan home. Do not ask about the attic. And whatever you do, do not follow the sounds at night, because those who did never returned. Even today, the house still stands, weathered, rotting, its windows black and hollow like watching eyes. No family has lived there in over a century, but locals say if you step inside on a quiet night, you can still hear them. The whispers, the sobs, the rattling of cages in the dark. 39 children, waiting to be set free. The Callahan mansion stood like a crown over Harrodsburg. To strangers passing through, it was a proud home of Southern gentility, but to those who lived in its shadow, it was a fortress of secrets. After Mary Donnelly's escape, the town began to stir with unease. At the general store, men spoke in hushed tones watching the hill as though the windows themselves could hear. Women clutched their children closer, whispering the name Callahan as though it were a curse. Still, there were those who dismissed the servant girl's story. "Hysteria," they said. "A maid who's read too many penny dreadfuls." But Mary's trembling voice haunted those who heard her. She had described details too specific, too vivid to be a mere invention. She spoke of the attic's air, thick, sour with the stench of unwashed bodies. She swore she heard children coughing, wheezing, their small voices begging for water, and she described the cages, lined in iron nails so no child could squeeze through. When she had first told her story, her hands shook uncontrollably. But her voice carried a certainty that planted seeds of fear in every heart. Then, not long after, another testimony surfaced. Thomas Redfield, a hired farmhand, claimed he too had seen something inside the Callahan home. He admitted he'd gone looking where he wasn't supposed to, up the narrow stairs to the attic. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, but the longer he stared into the gloom, the more certain he became. Rows of cages, pale hands reaching, out from the shadows, wide, unblinking eyes staring back at him. "I heard them," he whispered to the local pastor. "I swear on my life I heard them whispering, though their lips did not move, as if the attic itself was speaking." His words spread like wildfire, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. The Callahans remained outwardly untouched. John Callahan, tall and imposing, continued his business dealings without flinch. Eliza appeared at church, stiff and polished, her eyes always downcast. But Catherine was different. She was 16 then, a girl on the cusp of womanhood. To the town, she was a mystery. Pale as parchment, with black hair that hung in straight sheets, she seldom spoke to anyone outside the family. But when she did, her words unsettled people. Once a neighbor woman swore she overheard Catherine whispering to herself in the garden. "They're hungry," she said. "They're so hungry." Another claimed she saw Catherine carrying bowls of food toward the attic door, her lips moving as though she were answering voices only she could hear. And when questioned, Catherine only smiled, a soft, vacant smile, and said, "They're my brothers and sisters. They talk to me." Those words chilled the town to its marrow. Soon, suspicion reached the ears of Reverend Alcott, the pastor of the local church. Alcott was a stern man, not prone to superstition, but after hearing the testimonies, he felt a duty to intervene. With a few townsfolk, he climbed the hill one cold evening, lantern in hand. The Callahan mansion loomed in the twilight, its white columns streaked with rain. John Callahan greeted them at the door. His politeness was forced, his jaw tight. When Alcott asked to see the attic, John's expression hardened. "The attic?" His voice was calm but cold. "There is nothing of interest there, only old trunks and dust," Alcott insisted. John refused. It was Eliza who ended the standoff. She stepped forward, her hand on her husband's arm, and in a tone both gentle and sharp said, "If you wish to see dust, Reverend, then come, but do not insult our family with rumors." Reluctantly, John led them up the staircase. The wood creaked under their steps, the air growing colder as they climbed. When they reached the attic door, John unlocked it with a heavy iron key. The hinges groaned as the door swung open. The lantern light spilled into the attic. Dust hung in the air. Old trunks lined the walls. Broken furniture leaned against the beams. No cages, no children. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. The Reverend's brows knitted. He stepped deeper into the attic, his lantern sweeping over every shadow. Nothing, and yet the air felt wrong. It carried a weight, thick and heavy, as though it had been holding its breath for years. Then, faintly from somewhere beyond the lantern's glow, came a sound, a cough. Small, fragile. Everyone froze. John Callahan slammed the attic door shut. His voice thundered, "Enough. This insult ends now." The Reverend tried to protest, but John's glare silenced him. The townsfolk, shaken, retreated down the stairs. That night, the rumors only deepened, for though no one had seen a cage, All of them had heard the sound, and worse, every man swore that as the door closed, he saw Catherine Callahan standing in the shadows, her hand resting on something wooden, something shaped like bars. In the weeks that followed, the Callahans grew more withdrawn. Their shutters stayed closed even in daylight. Servants stopped answering the door. Catherine was no longer seen in the garden, but the sounds continued. On. Still nights, children's cries drifted across the fields. Sometimes the voices seemed desperate, pleading. Other times they sang, a strange, tuneless melody that set teeth on edge. Parents in town began to speak of curses. Some believed the Callahans had made a pact, wealth in exchange for innocence. Others whispered darker theories, that Eliza herself could not bear children, and that she and John had stolen them to build a family of their own. But none of these explanations could account for the number. 39. 39 children. Where had they come from, and what had become of them? By the spring of 1853, fear outweighed silence. A group of townsfolk gathered at the church, their voices sharp with anger. The Reverend, pale but resolute, declared that something had to be done. "We cannot ignore this any longer," he said. "If children suffer within those walls, then their blood is on our hands." A plan was formed. They would confront the Callahans openly. This time, they would not be turned away. But Catherine seemed to know. The night before the townsfolk marched up the hill, she appeared at the church steps, barefoot, her nightdress clinging to her frame, her eyes wild with a feverish glow. "They won't let you in," she whispered. "They don't want you to see. But you'll hear them. You'll always hear them." And before anyone could stop her, she fled back into the night. The next day, when the townsfolk stormed the mansion, the Callahans were gone. The shutters hung open. The doors swung wide. Food lay untouched on the dining table. But the house was empty. Every room, every hallway, every stair, until they reached the attic. There, the door hung open. The air was thick, suffocating, and in the darkness they found traces, rusted chains bolted to beams, small handprints smeared into the dust, wooden slats, broken, clawed at from within. But the cages themselves were gone, and so were the children. The Callahans were never seen again. Some say they fled west. Others believe they were swallowed by the very evil they had created. But the house remained, and from that day onward no family could live there long. The cries never stopped, the sobs, the whispers, the faint rattle of chains, always louder in the attic. The story of the Callahans had become legend, but for the people of Harrodsburg, it was no legend at all. It was a memory, a wound. And for those who dared climb the hill, it was still alive. It was the autumn of 1854, when neighbors began to notice something unusual about the Callahan household. By daylight, the house still looked respectable. Its white paint gleamed, and the family still appeared polished, polite, and charming at Sunday service. But at night, the atmosphere around the Callahan home shifted. Neighbors reported seeing faint candlelight flickering from the attic windows long after the rest of the town slept. Sometimes shadows moved across the panes, shadows far too many to belong to the 5 members of the Callahan family alone. And then came the noises. People spoke of thin voices drifting across the fields. They were high-pitched, desperate, like children calling out. Some said it was crying. Others claimed they heard singing, but the voices were faint, broken, and chillingly out of tune. One farmer, who lived half a mile away, swore he heard a chorus of small voices chanting together at midnight, as if rehearsing some grim ritual. When questioned, Elias Callahan always had an answer. The noises. Just the wind in the rafters. The lights. The boys and I work late into the night. The shadows. Perhaps your eyes played tricks in the fog. And because he was a respected man, a man who carried himself with confidence and spoke with the authority of wealth, most people swallowed his explanations. Most, but not all. In town, Miss Abigail Harrow, a schoolteacher in her late 30s, was one of the first to openly question the Callahans. She had noticed that while families around her continued to raise children, an unsettling pattern was emerging. Children were disappearing. They weren't vanishing in large numbers all at once. It was slower, quieter. A boy here, a girl there. Sometimes families moved away and claimed their children were sent to relatives. Sometimes children were said to have fallen sick and never recovered. But Abigail began to keep notes, and the list grew. By her count, 39 children had gone missing in the county over the span of just 2 years. 39, and no graves were ever seen, no letters from relatives received, and each disappearance, in some way, circled back to the Callahans. Some of the missing had last been seen near their farm. Others had families who owed debts to Elias, and some, Abigail realized with horror, were children whose parents had approached Elias for work, only for the parents to later claim their child had gone elsewhere. But when Abigail pressed them, their eyes always dropped. Their voices went quiet. Fear silenced them. She began to wonder if Elias Callahan was not just a farmer and a respected man, but something far darker. The suspicions might have died in whispers had it not been for the arrival of a stranger. In January of 1855, a traveling preacher named Josiah Graves passed through town. He was known for his fiery sermons and his obsession with rooting out sin. Some townsfolk called him overzealous, others called him a fanatic. But when he met Abigail and heard her concerns, he listened intently. That night, he stayed at an inn on the edge of town, and according to the innkeeper, he did not sleep. He kept pacing the floor, muttering scripture, staring toward the hills where the Callahan house stood. The next day, Josiah announced that he had received a sign from God that evil lurked in the Callahan attic. Of course, most townspeople rolled their eyes. A preacher seeing evil in a wealthy family? It was nothing new. But Abigail felt a jolt of icy recognition. She begged Josiah to tell her what he meant. He described a dream. Children trapped in darkness, their small hands clawing at wooden beams, their eyes wide with fear. He said the dream ended with the sound of chains rattling, echoing into silence. Abigail's blood ran cold. She had never spoken of the missing 39 to him. The preacher's warnings might still have been dismissed if not for one strange discovery. That February, a delivery boy named Jacob was sent to the Callahan house with a crate of grain. When he arrived, Elias was not home, but Margaret Callahan answered the door, flustered. She tried to send the boy away quickly, but Jacob, being young and curious, peeked around the side of the house. What he saw made him drop the crate. A thick rope hung from the attic window, frayed at the bottom as if it had been chewed or clawed. And on the frozen ground below there were small footprints, bare feet, far too small to belong to the Callahan children, who were nearly grown. Jacob told his parents. His parents told the sheriff. But when the sheriff confronted Elias Callahan, the rope was gone, the footprints erased by snow. Elias laughed off the story, saying, "Boys will imagine anything when they're spooked." And just like that, the matter was dropped. But Abigail Harrow would not drop it. She began to gather other stories, quiet testimonies from farmhands who had worked briefly for the Callahans, only to leave in fear. They spoke of strange locks on the attic door, of food being carried upstairs late at night, of muffled cries that made their blood freeze. It wasn't until spring of 1855 that the first real breakthrough came. A storm had swept through the county, tearing shingles from rooftops and branches from trees. The Callahan house was struck hard. And in the middle of the night, as rain poured and wind howled, neighbors claimed they heard something terrifying. The storm had loosened part of the Callahan roof, and through the broken boards, voices spilled out into the night, dozens of voices, high, desperate crying voices, like a chorus of suffering. The neighbors, trembling, told themselves it must be the wind. But deep down, they knew. No wind could ever sound like that. The next morning, Elias repaired the roof quickly, paying workers extra to keep quiet. But the whispers had spread. People in town began to look at him differently. Respect was slowly giving way to suspicion. Around this time, Margaret Callahan's demeanor shifted. Once soft-spoken and gentle, she grew pale and withdrawn. She stopped speaking to neighbors altogether. Her eyes carried a hollow look, as though she was living in constant dread. Some believed she was a victim, trapped by her husband's will. Others whispered she was complicit, that she fed the children in the attic, that her silence made her just as guilty. But Abigail noticed something new. Whenever Margaret was seen in town, she carried small bruises on her arms, as though someone had grabbed her too tightly. And sometimes her sleeves were stained, not with mud, but with something darker. By the end of that year, the town was divided. Half still defended Elias, insisting he was too powerful, too wealthy, and too important to accuse. The other half began to fear him openly, whispering that he was hiding something unnatural. But no one dared act. Not yet, and so the children remained in the attic. The truth was that by 1855, 39 children were trapped above the Callahan home, their lives reduced to shadows, whispers, and chains. Some had been there for months, others years, and yet the town, paralyzed by fear, allowed it to continue. It was as though an entire community had been bewitched, held silent under Elias's dark power. But silence never lasts forever, because in the summer of 1856, something happened inside that attic that could no longer be ignored, and when it did, the Callahan family's secret began to unravel. The Callahan farmhouse in Kentucky had always loomed like a shadow over the town. By 1853, its shutters rattled against the wind, its roof sagged with age, and the once proud white paint peeled into strips that looked like hanging flesh. Neighbors passed it in silence, some crossing themselves, others spitting in the dirt as if to ward off evil. But at night, when the moon cut across the wooden beams and the fields lay quiet, the house was anything but silent. People swore they heard it breathe, creaks in the attic floorboards, shifting weight overhead, the sound of children crying, or at least something that sounded like children. Some nights there was laughter, high-pitched and wrong, carrying across the black fields, like the sound of glass shattering. The Callahan family claimed it was nothing more than raccoons, or perhaps the settling of wood, but those who had gone inside, even briefly, said otherwise. One of them was a woman named Eliza Burke. Eliza had once worked as a servant for the Callahans. When she was 16, she fled in the middle of the night, barefoot, without a word. Her family never spoke of it, but townsfolk noticed the way she trembled when she passed the Callahan property years later, clutching her shawl tight, refusing to meet the eyes of Margaret Callahan in church. In the winter of 1853, Eliza returned to the farm, not willingly, but because her younger brother Samuel had gone missing. He had been seen playing near the Callahan orchard 2 days before his disappearance. Eliza came knocking on the Callahans' heavy oak door, the sound echoing through the house like gunshots. Thomas Callahan himself answered. His face was a stone, mask, lined deep, his eyes unreadable. "What brings you here, girl?" he asked, his voice deep and flat, as though it carried no warmth at all. Eliza forced the words out. "My brother, Samuel. He hasn't come home. He was last seen near your orchard. Did you see him?" For a moment, Thomas only stared. Then his lips curled into something resembling a smile, but it never touched his eyes. "No," he said. "We've seen no boy. Perhaps he ran off. Children do that." But Eliza swore she heard something then, faint but sharp, carried through the cracks of the house. A whimper, soft and frightened, coming from above, from the attic. Her blood went cold. She knew that sound. She had heard it years ago when she herself was young and trapped inside those walls. She tried to push past Thomas, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist so tight it left bruises. His voice dropped low. "Best leave, girl. Some doors aren't meant to open." Eliza left, but her eyes stayed fixed on the upper windows of the house. Behind one cracked curtain, she swore she saw a child's face staring down. The whispers about Samuel spread quickly, feeding old rumors that had never truly died. Parents kept their children indoors. Farmers stopped working the edges of their fields closest to the Callahan property. The church bells rang more often. Prayers said longer. Finally, the sheriff, a weary man named Elias Thatcher, rode out to the Callahan farm. He was not a man of superstition, but he was a man of duty. Missing children meant something was wrong. Thomas greeted him politely, as if nothing were amiss. Margaret hovered behind her husband, eyes cast downward, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Elias asked his questions, careful but direct. "Your orchard borders the road. The Burke boy was seen there. Did you speak to him? Did you invite him in?" Thomas shook his head. "We keep to ourselves, Sheriff. You know that." But Elias noticed something strange. The Callahan's 3 surviving children, 2 boys and a girl, did not appear. No laughter from the yard, no curious eyes peeking from doorways. In fact, the house seemed too still, as though every breath inside it had been drawn in and held. Then there was the smell. Elias described it later as dampness mixed with iron, something foul that seemed strongest when he stood beneath the narrow staircase leading upward to the attic. He asked if he might look around. Thomas's smile was calm, but his hands clenched. "With respect, Sheriff, this is private property," Elias pressed. "Then you won't mind me searching, will you, to set these rumors to rest?" For the first time, Thomas's mask cracked. His voice rose, thunderous. "There are no rumors in this house. There is only family. Now leave." Elias left, but the stench of that house followed him long after. And worse, when he rode past the orchard, he heard something in the wind, a faint chorus of voices, small and broken, whispering his name. That spring, storms battered Kentucky. Lightning split trees in half, winds tore shingles from roofs. On one of those nights, a neighbor swore he saw the attic windows of the Callahan house thrown open by the wind, and what he saw inside nearly stopped his heart. Children, dozens of them. Their small, pale faces pressed to the glass. Some reached out with tiny hands. Others bared their teeth, their mouths wide in silent screams, and when the lightning flashed again, they were gone. The next day, the neighbor said nothing. He drank until he passed out, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't lift his mug. But the rumors grew darker. People began to recall strange things from years past. Children who had gone missing, families who left town without explanation. And always, the Callahans stood untouched, their land fertile, their livestock healthy, while those around them starved or suffered. Some whispered that Margaret had been seen walking the fields at night, carrying a lantern, her lips moving in chants. Others swore that Thomas dug holes in the orchard under the cover of darkness, burying things that weren't crops, and still, no one dared step inside the attic. It was Margaret, in the end, who cracked first. The townsfolk had always pitied her, a thin woman with hollow eyes who seemed to fade more each year. But one Sunday after the service, she collapsed at the church steps. When the pastor bent to help her, she gripped his sleeve with desperate strength. "They know," she whispered. "They always know. The floorboards don't keep quiet anymore." When the pastor tried to calm her, she wept. "He promised me it was mercy, that we were saving them from worse. But they cry to me at night. 39 voices, 39 children, and they won't stop." The congregation fell silent. No one dared speak the number aloud. 39. No one could forget it. By the summer of 1853, fear gripped the town like a sickness. No child was allowed near the Callahan property. Families whispered of packing up and leaving. But there was a darker divide among the people. Those who believed the Callahans were cursed, and those who believed they were criminals hiding a sin too large to name. And through it all, the house groaned. Floorboards cracked at night. Lights flickered in the attic when no one should have been there. Travelers who passed the road swore they heard children begging for release. And then came the day when the attic door opened on its own. A storm had blown through, and a group of men took shelter in the Callahan barn. While there, they heard it, footsteps above. Dozens of them, running, scattering, thudding against the boards. The attic door, swollen with rain, broke loose, and from inside the house came a wave of cold air so sharp it made their teeth ache. The men fled. None ever returned. The Callahans remained inside their house, the shutters closed, the curtains drawn. But the truth had seeped into the soil, into the wood of the house, into the minds of everyone who lived within sight of it. 39 children, an attic that breathed, and a family guarding something they could never let the world see. The question was no longer whether something was hidden there. The question was, how much longer until it broke free? By the late 1870s, decades after the Callahan house had swallowed its last screams, silence itself became the loudest haunting. The people of Rowan County no longer spoke openly about the Callahans, but the name lingered like a curse, muttered only in whispers, always followed by a shiver. The mansion sat abandoned, rotting on the hill, its windows dark like eyeless sockets staring over the town. Yet for all the silence, the truth had not been buried. It was waiting, like bones under the floorboards, for the right moment to be unearthed. In 1879, a group of travelers came through Rowan County. Among them was a young newspaper man from Ohio named Thomas Gray, eager for stories that could shake readers and elevate his reputation. He had heard rumors in neighboring counties, a cursed house, children's laughter in the wind, a wealthy family who vanished without explanation. Where the locals lowered their heads and kept walking, Gray pressed harder. He wanted answers. But what he didn't know was that curiosity about the Callahans had a cost. Every stranger who came asking too many questions left town, sometimes by choice, sometimes by fear, sometimes not at all. Gray convinced 2 men to guide him to the mansion. One was a farmer named Elias Turner, the other a church caretaker, Samuel Pike. Both had grown up in the county and swore they would never step inside. But Gray's coin was persuasive, and his persistence wore them down. On an overcast October afternoon, the 3 men climbed the hill. The mansion loomed in the distance, choked with ivy, shutters hanging loose like broken wings. The air smelled of damp wood and rot, and as they approached, the ground seemed to soften beneath their boots, as though the earth itself was warning them to turn back. Don't linger long. Folks say the house ain't empty. Never was. Gray laughed it off, but Samuel crossed himself twice before the door even opened. Inside, dust lay thick, and silence wrapped the house in a suffocating embrace. The walls bore water stains like weeping faces, and cobwebs sagged in every corner. But upstairs, always upstairs, there was a pull. The attic. The men hadn't climbed more than 2 steps when Elias froze. He swore he heard it, the shuffle of bare feet overhead. Gray, determined, pushed higher until the 3 reached the narrow attic stair. The air grew colder, the boards creaked as though straining under invisible weight. The attic door was padlocked, rust having eaten at its edges. Yet from behind it, thud. Then another thud, thud, like the sound of something shifting inside. Elias turned pale. Samuel muttered prayers under his breath. Gray pressed his ear against the wood. His breath caught. On the other side of that door, so faint it could have been a memory, came the unmistakable sound of a child's voice, a whisper, fragile, repeating just 2 words, "Let out." The men fled that day. Elias swore never to return. Samuel fell ill a week later and would not speak of what they heard. But Gray, Gray was different. That night in the inn, he could not sleep. He wrote notes feverishly, describing the sound, the smell of rot, the feeling of being watched. The more he wrote, the more he felt it. The sensation of small fingers brushing across his neck, of a child's breath at his ear. The haunting followed him, clung to him. Within days, Thomas Gray was obsessed. He had to know what was inside that attic. On his 3rd night in Rowan County, he made his choice. Alone, under a full moon, Gray returned to the mansion. He carried a lantern, a crowbar, and his unshakable arrogance. The night was cold, but sweat poured down his back as he climbed those attic stairs. The padlock gleamed in the lantern's light. With trembling hands, he raised the crowbar. The first strike echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. The second split the silence wide open. By the third, the lock fell away, and the door drifted open. Gray raised his lantern high. Inside, the room was larger than he expected, stretching the length of the roof, its rafters thick with cobwebs. But the first thing he saw stopped his breath. Cages. Row after row of wooden enclosures, like crude pens, lined against the walls. Rusted chains still hung from some, their ends bolted to the floor. Beneath them lay scraps of fabric, gnawed bones, small shoes half buried in dust. But worst of all were the marks. On the walls, carved deep into the wood with desperate fingers. Tally marks. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Each line a day spent in captivity. Each cluster of scratches ended abruptly, as though the hands that carved them no longer had strength to continue. Gray's chest heaved, his lantern shook, and then the air shifted. From the farthest corner of the attic came the faint rustle of chains. The lantern light caught movement. Something small, hunched, dragging itself forward. A child. No, not quite. A shadow shaped like one, gaunt, its head tilted unnaturally, its eyes two pits of hollow darkness. It crawled toward him with unnatural slowness. Behind it, another rose, and another, dozens of them. The children of the Callahan attic. Children's voices, whispering, overlapping. Stay with us. Don't leave. Play forever. Gray dropped his lantern. The flame snuffed out on impact, plunging him into suffocating darkness. His scream tore through the mansion, down the hill, into the valley below. A scream that carried so far the innkeeper heard it from town. By dawn, the Callahan house was silent again. When the innkeeper checked Gray's room, his belongings remained. Notes, sketches, even his boots. But Gray himself? Gone. The townsfolk said the children had taken him, dragged him into their endless game. Others believed he ran mad into the woods and never returned. But those who dared walk past the mansion swore they heard him still, his voice joining the chorus of whispers leaking from the attic. Thomas Gray was not the last. Over the next decade, more strangers came seeking the Callahan legend. Some returned shaken, unwilling to speak. Others vanished like Gray. By 1890, the county sealed off the hill entirely, declaring the mansion unsafe, a danger to trespassers. But locals knew better. It wasn't the wood or stone that was dangerous. It was what lingered inside. The children had grown restless. Now anyone who wandered too close, anyone who listened too carefully, might hear them, might feel them, might become one of them. By the end of the century, the Callahan mansion was no longer just a ruin. It was a tomb of voices, and every voice belonged to a child who was never meant to leave. But the most haunting truth of all was not how many died there. It was that no one could say for sure if they ever truly died at all. History has a way of burying its monsters. Time softens the memory of cruelty, reshapes terror into whispers, and leaves the dead to cry in silence. But some wounds are too deep, some sins too vile, to ever heal with time. The Callahan estate is one of those wounds. For nearly 2 centuries, it has stood in Kentucky's soil, its walls holding more than timber and stone. They hold the screams of the forgotten. They hold the weight of 39 innocent souls who never saw freedom. But the final chapter of the Callahan story would not belong to the 19th century. It would belong to us, here, in the modern day. And what was uncovered should have never been found. In 2017, a small group of urban explorers set out to film abandoned places across Kentucky. Their channel was modest, dedicated to history and ghost lore. They weren't thrill seekers looking for cheap scares. They wanted to capture beauty in ruins. But when their cameras turned toward the Callahan property, what they captured was neither beautiful nor ruin. It was something else entirely. The house stood, sagging but proud, cloaked in vines, its windows like dark, staring eyes. From the road, it seemed asleep, but the explorers swore, as they crossed the broken fence, they felt watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by dozens. 39 pairs. Inside, the floors groaned beneath their boots. The air smelled of dust and mold, and yet, under it all, was a faint sweetness, like spoiled fruit, or rot that refused to die. Their cameras tracked the peeling wallpaper, the collapsed furniture, the remnants of a life long gone. But it wasn't until they reached the second floor that they saw it. The door, small, narrow, built at the very end of a hallway. It seemed wrong. Its wood darker than the rest, the knob rusted, and the frame bowed as though it had been forced closed countless times. On its surface were long scratches, deep, desperate scratches. The explorers laughed nervously. They made jokes to hide their unease. One muttered, "Maybe that's where they locked the bad kids." He didn't know how right he was. They pulled the door open. Hinges screamed. A stench poured out, dust, rot, and something coppery, metallic. Something like dried blood. The attic staircase was narrow, steep, suffocating. Their flashlights jittered. Across the walls, carved into the wood, were names, dozens of them. Small hands had etched them in, letters crooked, desperate. Mary, Elias, Samuel, Anna. 39 names. Every single one belonged to a child who never walked out alive. When they reached the top, their camera lights swept across the attic, and what they saw should have never been filmed. Iron cages. Small ones. Some are no bigger than dog kennels. Rusted but still intact. Lined up against the walls, row by row. Inside there were scraps of cloth. Bones. Tiny, brittle bones. The explorers fell silent. For the first time, their recording captured not their voices, but their breathing. Fast, shallow, panicked. One whispered, This is where they kept them." Another said, "No one's going to believe this." And then, the camera picked up something else. A sound. At first I faint. Then louder. The shuffle of small feet. The whisper of voices layered together, too many to count. And then, singing. A nursery rhyme. Off-key, slow, sung in voices that weren't there. The explorers ran. Their footage, later uploaded, cut off. Mid-scream. What survived online was just 24 minutes of shaky video. But those who have watched it claim they saw something in the final seconds, just before the camera drops. A face. Small. Hollow. Eyes black as tar. After the video spread online, historians and journalists were forced to confront the truth. The town of Callahan had buried for generations. Records surfaced, old court documents, fragments of testimony that had once been dismissed as rumor. But the most chilling piece came from an interview found in a forgotten archive, dated 1902. The interview was with a woman named Ellen McRae. She was 74 years old at the time. She claimed she had once been a child servant in the Callahan household. She remembered the cages. She remembered the children. She remembered Mrs. Callahan walking the attic with a lantern at night, humming lullabies to the starving. She remembered Mr. Callahan counting heads like livestock, and Ellen revealed something else. Not all the children died. One lived. A boy, the oldest, 14 years old. He had survived by stealing food scraps from rats, by drinking rainwater that leaked through the roof. But survival had changed him. He grew thin, feral, more animal than child. When the authorities raided the Callahan estate in 1853, Ellen claimed they found him curled in the corner of the attic, still gnawing on the bones of another child. His name was Isaac Callahan. He was never seen again. In the decades that followed, strange deaths haunted anyone who tried to profit from the Callahan property. A banker who foreclosed on the land was found drowned in his own well. A developer who planned to demolish the house hanged himself before the first bulldozer arrived. Locals whispered of a curse, that the children of Callahan still roamed the attic, searching for company, and those who entered never left untouched. Today, the house still stands. Some nights, passers-by swear they see candlelight flickering in the upper window. Some swear they hear children laughing. But most chilling of all are the reports from those few brave enough to step inside. They say the cages remain. They say the names are still carved in the wood. They say if you whisper one of those names aloud, you'll hear a whisper back, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, you'll hear them all. 39 voices, whispering at once, and in the dark corner of the attic, a taller shadow. Watching. Waiting. Isaac. The Callahan family built their fortune on cruelty, and in death they left behind something darker than any ledger, darker than any tombstone. They left behind the silence of children who were never allowed to grow up. But silence cannot hold forever. If you ever find yourself in rural Kentucky, driving a dirt road at night, and you see a house standing alone, windows like eyes staring through the dark, keep driving. Do not stop. Do not look back. Because the attic remembers, and the children are still waiting. The end.